The following program, The Russ Belville Show, is intended for responsible adults only. We advocate to the repeal of marijuana prohibition for adults. We discuss the science, culture, and controversy about America's marijuana laws. We do not advocate any illegal activity and encourage all listeners to learn their state and federal marijuana laws. Opinions and claims made by guests and advertisers on The Russ Belville Show are their own, and The Russ Belville Show cannot be held legally responsible for their validity or reliability. Viewer discretion is advised.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it, and it goes down smooth. Hey!
Spanning the continent to bring you the truth about cannabis and marijuana law reform.
I smoke pot and I like it a lot.
From the promise of legalization.
And I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our marijuana laws.
To the agony of prohibition.
One major responsibility is to encourage people to use less drugs.
The Russ Belville Show, the voice of the marijuana nation.
Yeah, I hear you had a question for me.
Now, here's your host, Radical Russ Belville.
We love the earth.
Our government at work.
Good day, Tokers and Tokats. Radical Russ here, live at the State House in Salem, Oregon, for this special edition of the Russ Belville Show. Kevin Sabet from Project SAM, Smart Approaches Against Marijuana, is scheduled to testify here in Salem in Hearing Room F. People are now beginning to gather, and I've just spoken with Noelle Crombie from the Oregonian. She is in the room right now as well. Hearing room is beginning to fill up. We're going to bring you live coverage of the hearing starting here at 2 p.m. You can see hearing room is starting to fill up here. And we have provided for the people here that don't know so much about Kevin Sabet a handy guide. I don't know if you can see that there, the testimony to rebut. And we have a number of people watching that right at the moment. A number of different activist groups are in. Good to see this man here.
Hey, Russ, how you doing?
We're on live with 420 Radio. Are you looking forward to the testimony today?
Oh, yes, very much so. Good chance for us to deal with the prohibitionist rhetoric straight on.
Have you seen the slideshow that he's got prepared?
No, I haven't.
Let me grab you a copy of that. This is the slideshow that will be showing considerations for public health and policy. And right off the bat, we open up with 1 in 6 teens get addicted to marijuana, which is one of the charts that I have in my rebuttal showing that the way he came up with that number was by adding up cumulative numbers.
Sure. Yeah, and use is addiction.
Yeah, and all use is addiction. That's right. So we'll be taking a look at that. We will bring this PowerPoint back to our show on Monday, and we will deconstruct this even better. We'll also have this recorded. We're showing this live on 420 Radio as well.
You folks be sure to check it out, follow up these facts and spread the word. All this information, we need to get it out to the regular folks like yourself.
That's right. All right, so we're going to take a look around outside, and then when we come back, we will have our live coverage of this hearing here. It's starting at 2 p.m. Pacific time, just at the top of the hour. So Brian the Red will be there in the studio at Rolla J and probably kick in some music here for you until we get started. So stay tuned. I'm Radical Russ. We'll be right back.
Okay, we'll open an informational meeting on marijuana and call Dr. Sabet, please.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chair Barker, Chair Senator Polanski, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to discuss marijuana policy and state responses and the evidence around the impact of use and what can be learned already from what Washington State and Colorado have been going through. Just very briefly, I have studied, researched, and written about drug policy, drug markets, drug prevention, treatment, criminal justice policy, addiction, and public policy analysis for almost 18 years. Most recently, I served as a senior drug policy advisor to President Obama's White House Office of Drug Policy, served previously in 2003 in the Bush administration and in 2000 in the Clinton administration as a researcher. Along with Patrick Kennedy. Sure.
Could you just take the microphone and move it away from you because we're getting feedback?
Great. Along with former U.S. Congressman Patrick Kennedy, I co-founded Smart Approaches to Marijuana, a sensible third way marijuana policy organization that focuses on a health-based approach to our nation's drug policies, in particular marijuana. And I'm the author of Reefer Sanity, 7 Great Myths About Marijuana. And all of my testimony today is further detailed in that book. So you'll see that I have a written testimony for the record that I'd like to submit, and as well as a PowerPoint presentation that covers a lot of already what is covered in the written testimony. I'm going to go fairly quickly through the PowerPoint that's rather lengthy. You have copies of them, and I'm very happy to take questions and engage in a conversation on this issue. Just to start us, I think it's important to ground us when we look at what our rates of different drugs are in society today in America. About 6 times as many Americans 12 and older drink regularly, have taken at least 1 drink in the last month is the definition. About 3 to 4 times as many Americans smoke cigarettes regularly, 12 and older. This is all according to the National Institutes of Health. And about between 7 and 9%, actually that figure should be updated, are regular users of marijuana. So I just think it is interesting to look at the trajectory between our legal and illegal drugs in terms of the use rates that we have. The first myth, and I'll go through a few of them today, is one that I probably get the most, which is that marijuana is relatively harmless and non-addictive. And I think that a lot of people have had that experience of it being relatively harmless and non-addictive, just as the majority of users, really of all substances, do not go on to become addicts. I mean, we should be very clear about cocaine users, initiates, heroin as well, and other drugs, certainly alcohol, that actually most users try the substance once or twice and do not go further. Marijuana is the same, but the issue is that even though a minority of overall users get addicted to any drug that we're talking about, that minority of users can cause great social damage. And so what we do know is that if you're 16 and you try marijuana, 1 in 6 16-year-olds, according to the National Institutes of Health, will become addicted at some point in their life to marijuana. That is roughly the same rate as alcohol for adolescents. It's certainly lower than tobacco, heroin, and cocaine. But 1 in 6 and that 15%, which is the third bar from the left, is not a trivial number, I would argue. And in fact, when you look at treatment in this country, the vast majority of those in treatment are there for marijuana. About half of those people were referred by the criminal justice system, and about half were referred really by themselves or families or schools, etc. And the reason it's 1 in 10 adults, or 1 in 11 adults, between 10 and 11, that get addicted, and 1 in 6 adolescents is because the adolescent brain is vulnerable, right? The brain is forming until about age 25 or 28. Anything that enters the brain or bloodstream at a young age has the ability to affect that person's life. Actually, in the good or bad, right? It's why we learn a second language when we're 3 or 4 years old versus when we're 40 or 50. It's much more difficult. Or why we learn to swim or ride a bike when we're young. Because our brain is developing, and it's harder to actually to do that as you advance in life. Drugs are the same thing. Any drug that enters the brain or bloodstream has the, at least potential, and it doesn't happen to everybody, we should be very clear, but has the potential to become addictive for them. When I talk to a lot of parents and others, even those who were regular marijuana smokers in the 80s, I think the striking thing is that the product smoked really in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and by a lot of parents today, really does not resemble the product that most kids are smoking today in 2014. And what I mean by that is we know that the psychoactive ingredient in marijuana, which is THC, now remember, there are hundreds of components in marijuana, in fact thousands when you heat it up and smoke it. The psychoactive ingredient, THC, is the one that gets you high. There are other ingredients in marijuana. actually, scientists don't even know about most of those other ingredients. We know about a few of them. One is called CBD that you might have heard of. Certainly, if you watched a recent special by CNN on children with seizures, you heard about CBD. That's very different than THC, because actually THC gets you high, CBD doesn't. In fact, high CBD marijuana takes the high away from the THC. That's why there are medications in other countries that are very high in THC, but also high in CBD that do not get you high, because the CBD takes that away. Now, you probably would have guessed it, CBD is not something that people growing marijuana and selling it to others to get high are going to be wanting to emphasize, because it takes the high away. You don't want a product that doesn't get you high. And so CBD has really been almost bred out of modern marijuana that a kid would get a hold of. Now you can still find some CBD strains grown specially for certain patients in some medical dispensaries, but by and large, a kid's access to underground market marijuana is not going to have CBD in it. But THC has grown, as you can see on the chart, exponentially since the 60s and 70s. And that's why a lot of researchers think really the THC is the reason why we've seen a sharp rise in things like emergency room admissions over the last 20 years. Even though we have about the same number of overall users, more or less, from the early 90s to now, we have about 20 times more that are entering emergency room admissions, usually from an acute psychotic episode of a high THC product of some sort. Now we've risen to almost 400,000 emergency room admissions. Now, is that a high percentage of overall experiences with marijuana? No. So we're not here to say that everybody who smokes marijuana is heading to the ER tonight. The issue is it is a risk. Like everything else, it is a risk, and we need to understand those risks. I'm not going to dwell on this further, but marijuana does affect parts of the brain, really primarily responsible for memory, learning, attention, and reaction time. I think the reason why someone like Congressman Kennedy has put his name out there on this, someone who has really dedicated his life to reducing stigma and discrimination for mental illness. In fact, he was really the one, along with others, it was a bipartisan effort in Congress, as you all know, to have the U.S. Congress recognize that the brain is part of the body, which was something that was very controversial, actually, when it was from a lawmaker's point of view, if you can believe it. And the nexus with mental illness, schizophrenia and psychosis, is something that a lot of researchers are very, very concerned about. We don't need to go into a lot of details about lungs, other than there really isn't a link right now between cancer, a strong link between lung cancer and marijuana. We're still researching those issues. What we do know, though, and I think this is very important for educators in the state, because actually this is where it affects the jobs of those who are educating our children, and this is where I think teachers should listen up more than anybody, because they're the ones held accountable for kids, especially when they do badly in school. And when your schools fail at exams. And this is the finding that was pretty startling from last year, that was challenged and then reevaluated, actually, and confirmed by many others, and including the National Institutes of Health, which was that regular marijuana smoking as a teenager, persistent, heavy marijuana smoking, was significantly connected to a 6 to 8 point average decline in IQ by the time that person was 38, controlling for everything else, controlling for other drug use, controlling for educational attainment, parental, socioeconomic factors. And that, I think, when we're trying to race to the top here, education-wise, I think we need to think about what kind of state that we're, and nation that we're producing, when I don't think anybody argues that legalization and policies that open up accessibility will increase at least some levels of use. We can argue what those levels are among, who they are among, but almost everybody, I think, agrees that we would have increased use with that. I'm not going to go into a lot of the details about dropping out of school, unemployment, social welfare dependence, absences, tardiness, accidents in the workplace. This is frankly why a lot of businesses are very concerned about this. It will affect them and their bottom line. I'm going to skip really very quickly through the medical part, because that's not really, we're really not here to relitigate medical marijuana that was passed in Oregon, except just to give you what my 1-minute elevator speech or less is when I'm asked about, is marijuana medicine? And the answer is yes. Marijuana has medicinal properties, but we don't need to smoke, eat, or vaporize it to get those properties. Very similar to opium, right? We don't smoke opium to get the positive medicinal effects of morphine. Thankfully, we've moved on from needing to smoke a medicine to do that. And so I think we need to make a really distinguish between the components in marijuana that have medicinal value and raw herbal marijuana that we would smoke. And so that I'm going to skip most of this because that's really the main thing. Other than to say, I think a quote that's really interesting when we look at the leaders of the legalization movement, I mean, they said very openly that they will be using medical marijuana as a red herring to give marijuana a good name. And they've done a wonderful job at doing that, frankly, around the country. This progression from medicinal marijuana to marijuana is one not only planned, but very, very well executed. I'm going to go forward. Well, one thing I think is noteworthy is that we know that, according to the most astute, journal looking at this issue, that drivers intoxicated under the influence of marijuana are twice as likely to get in a car crash. That's about compared to 4 to 5 times likely for alcohol. So yes, alcohol in terms of deadlier on the road, it is. However, I would argue we don't want either scenario to happen. And I think when we get into this very strange conversation about what's safer, one or the other, it really distracts us from the fact that, especially among young people and problem users, we want to discourage use of both substances. And when we look actually at heavy users, especially arrestees, and also those in treatment, those heavy users of marijuana are also heavy users of alcohol. So the evidence among that high-risk population, which is a population we care about because they cause the social damage of this, really shows that these actually are used together. So we got to be very mindful of that when discussing the different drugs and alcohol, etc. I'm not going to talk about that. I think one of the myths and one of the interesting things in Oregon here, you led the way in the early 1970s. The first state to decriminalize marijuana, I believe, 1973. And what's interesting is that not only in Oregon, but around the country, it is very difficult to find people serving time in state prison, let alone federal, whose only crime is smoking marijuana. When you take out all the other crimes, probation and parole violations aside, it's very difficult. And in fact, in Oregon, I don't think anybody last night, I would like to see the stats, and I have looked at the statistics, especially because you did sentencing reform recently, is spending time in prison because of smoking a joint. Again, other than a probation or parole violation. So what's interesting is that, I think a lot of people think that legalization is just about allowing an otherwise responsible 50-year-old guy to smoke a joint after work at the end of a week, and let's give him a break and get the cops off his back. I would say that's sort of the status quo, actually, and it's not what legalization is at all. What legalization really is the introduction of commercial sales. And the reason you have someone from the left, like Congressman Kennedy, someone from the right, like David Frum, joining us, and the reason why we have the American Medical Association that has a very similar policy as we do in opposing the legalization of marijuana sales, is that we are really concerned about the creation of the next big tobacco. That's really what this comes down to for us, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, and I'll move on. So essentially, this argument that the legality of alcohol and tobacco strengthens the case for marijuana. First of all, the use levels for alcohol and tobacco are much higher than for marijuana. Not among kids. Actually, kids smoke tobacco less. I would argue it's not because it's legal. That's been the case for 100 years. It's because we have a societal, whole societal movement against tobacco. I don't see anybody waving the flag and saying we need to, smoking tobacco isn't that bad for you. And in fact, we should note that we're having this hearing on the 50th anniversary of the Surgeon General's report linking linking tobacco smoke with cancer, 1964. I think it's ironic that we're maybe contemplating following that similar path as we did with tobacco, and I hope we don't have to take 100 years to learn and then realize that we made a mistake in promoting tobacco use, which we did for a very long time. The second bullet, like I said, is really the one that I'm very concerned with, and that is the fact that industries really promote addiction and target kids, and that's what this is about. We hear the alcohol industry say enjoy responsibly. We hear that from other industries as well. The interesting thing is that if everybody enjoyed responsibly their marijuana and it was just a 50-year-old guy smoking a joint once every 2 weeks, we would have no need for a marijuana industry. The same reason we would have no need for a tobacco industry if everyone smoked a pack on their birthday and that was about it. Addictive companies rely on these companies rely on addiction for profit, because that's the only way to make money. You don't make money off the casual user. Las Vegas doesn't make money or give the Trump Tower suite to the guy that comes and plays blackjack with $100 once a year for his birthday. They give the Trump Tower suite to the guy that's betting his whole bank account on a regular basis. It's because that's where the business comes from. And the concern is not about, I don't think people should be criminalized for low levels of use. Not everybody that uses marijuana even needs treatment or an intervention. But I don't see how we would go from that conclusion jumping to we need to legalize and regulate this, because we've seen with tobacco and with other regulated substances that we're going to have wild and widespread promotion. And we are beginning that in Colorado and Washington, and I will talk about that in a second. But we have it with marijuana already. We have the pot entrepreneurs, as they're called, Marijuana Inc. We have multi-million-dollar private investment groups that have started in Wall Street and other places investing in a marijuana industry. And I don't think these are facts that the American people know. I don't think that people who voted in Colorado and Washington thought that they were voting not only for a pot shop probably in their own neighborhood, but not only that, but also to support an industry who relies on glamorizing this and is it now announced themselves. These aren't my words, folks. These are the words of people who are out there. They have said themselves, we are big marijuana. They want to create the marijuana version of a Marlboro cigarette, and they are encouraging investors to get in now while the ground is running. They want to create the Anheuser-Busch of marijuana, according to a multi-millionaire 29-year-old from Northern California. They want to do that, and they're spending millions on lobbying in order to make sure that they have a friendly business environment to do their business. We even know that the tobacco industry themselves have wanted to get involved in this. A memo released that we were able to get a hold of because of the tobacco settlement showed that in the 70s, when the last time we were going down this path of legalization in this country, that Brown and Williamson, now part of R.J. Reynolds, I believe, basically had an entire consulting firm look at this issue. And they said, very much so, we will get involved in this. This is very good for us. We have the land, the people, the marketing. Why wouldn't we? And I think that is very scary. So my big concern is not about the otherwise responsible adult smoking marijuana once in a while. It is not. My concern is about a new industry that we call big marijuana. I'm not going to go into all these details, but we have the confidential memos of the tobacco industry and how they lied to the American people for 80 years about what they were doing to kids, and about how they even had memos called Youth Cigarette New Concepts that we now have copies of. I just can't imagine we wouldn't have this again for marijuana. And we got rid of the tobacco vending machines mostly in this country. Well, now we have marijuana vending machines. 4 companies, one of which at least revenued $2.2 million last year. Now this is supposed to be for medicine. This is but now with full legalization, they're ready to go. The advertising and billboards that are attractive, and I think something shocking to most people that don't understand this: the candies and brownies and grape sodas that are out there now that are being marketed. Now these are under the guise of medicine. Let's be very, very clear. And I guess I don't know somebody with a terminal illness that's going to be as attracted to a skeletal monkey on a grape soda bottle, but they claim this is for those that are sick and dying. I worry about what this industry is going to do if we really go to full-scale legalization. I don't think parents realize that these are brownies, candies, sodas, lollipops, and items that are attractive to kids. It is exactly taking the playbook from the tobacco industry and executing it very well. So I don't think there's any money in this, and I don't think there's any money in this for you, for state legislators, at all. I think that when we look at alcohol and tobacco, this is the case in Oregon and in all states. For every dollar that we get in federal and state, for every dollar in alcohol and tobacco tax revenue, it costs us 10 in social costs. Now, what are the social costs of increased marijuana use? Well, we don't know yet. But we do know that tobacco costs that, and that's mainly the health costs, because tobacco doesn't cause car crashes. Tobacco is not linked with intoxication that doesn't allow you to act properly at work, for example. And yet it still has those costs. So I think that we really need to think about this. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, the last time I checked, the state lottery here and in most states around the country, in all states, no state lottery has been the savior for public education as we were promised. So this is once again one of these promises of new schools and new roads if we only would legalize another substance, but it really is a charade. I'm not even convinced that we would have lower arrests. We actually arrest 3 times as many people for non-violent alcohol regulatory violations every year than marijuana, and actually double all drugs combined. So this is actually about more regulation, and it's frankly, you're going to have law enforcement and treatment are going to be more in demand because there's going to be increased users and increased problems that then they have to mop up. And doesn't mean to say that prohibition or what we're doing now, whatever we want to call it, in Oregon we call it decriminalization because that's what it is here for possession. It doesn't mean to say that that is perfect. There are obviously problems. We don't like the fact that money goes to bad people in the black market right now to do very bad things. That is a very negative aspect of current policy, and we should admit that. But when we look, if the alternative is opening us up a la big tobacco and opening it up to an industry, which is, again, unless we're ready to repeal the First Amendment, what we're going to have when commercial speech is deemed free speech, I think it's a real problem. I'm going to skip the myth about Europe. I'm going to just go into what the federal guidance, I think, was, and then Washington and Colorado. Clearly, the Attorney General's office did not endorse legalization. What they said is they're going to defer their right to challenge right now. Okay, so they're going to let Washington and Colorado go forward. They're going to look at certain things like drugged driving, youth use, race, advertising for youth, and try and gauge what the effects of that has been. And I would actually argue, as I did in front of the U.S. Senate Judiciary, that this in some ways has already happened. Colorado has the most open, next to California, the most open medical marijuana program you could imagine. I mean, talk about more dispensaries than Starbucks coffees in Denver. And a huge lobby that has been growing for the last decade in Denver and in Boulder and other parts of Colorado. So they've seen already before their legalization in full measure went forward what the effects have been. And I don't think they've been pretty. I mean, Colorado is above the national average of use. Drug-related referrals from high school students have gone up. The second bullet is startling. 3/4 of kids in a treatment clinic, about 150 kids in a marijuana treatment center in Denver, report that their marijuana comes from a medical source that either they got themselves or they got from a friend who essentially faked an injury, an older friend. I mean, that is a huge issue of diversion. Anyway, on and on. Total car crashes have gone down from 800 to 600 in Colorado, except crashes with people testing positive for marijuana, THC, actually rose from about 25 to 55 during the time that all car crashes went down, as you can see. ER admissions, you're going to look at this graph and be puzzled. How could somebody under 5 be going to the ER, documented going to the ER in the Journal of Pediatrics for marijuana? Are they smoking marijuana? No. They're getting their hands on the edibles. And when you have a kid eating a marijuana brownie with 30% THC or 20% THC or even 10% THC for that matter, and that is going into the, being affected by a 5-year-old brain, you're going to be spending the night in the ER. You can guarantee that. And that is exactly what dozens of families have gone through in Colorado since this has been opened up.
Excuse me.
In addition...
Excuse me a minute, Doctor. This is invited testimony. You're not invited. You speak up like that one more time, you're out of here. I mean, I'm getting tired of listening to your cracks. Thank you. Please continue.
In addition, when the state of Colorado and the city of Denver actually hired an independent auditor to see how they've done, basically the independent auditor gave them an F. They had done very poorly. They had not regulated the system. I'm not going to read the audit here, but it was embarrassing and damning, and it came out last August because they're finding out that a handful of doctors are giving thousands of recommendations. There's no control structure, and this is medical. So I don't see how we're now going to go from medical if we can't control it. And I know you've had challenges in the legislature of trying to lasso, and I commend you for trying to do that, the program now, and at least have some semblance of control on it. We haven't even been able to do that here, let alone in Colorado. And yet going towards full legalization, I think, should be questioned. I'm going to address something that I know, having spent a few days in Oregon, that has been coming up over and over, and that is, what if we could just write it ourselves? So the legislature could write the rules. The legislature could pass something that would be not, just something written by a lobbying group of marijuana, but hey, it's here to stay. We can't put our heads in the sand. Let's do the best we can. Essentially, and I've seen the different proposals in the quote-unquote most reasonable one, it's essentially a carbon copy, very similar to the ones in Colorado and Washington. And during the campaign, a lot of those folks said the same thing. They said, we're going to have control over this. We're going to regulate it. We're going to have control. And we're going to take it out of the hands of criminals. We're going to put the rules on. Let me tell you something. When this was passed in November, all bets were off. And what I mean by that is that every single reasonable regulation that you would have expected from a group saying that they want to be able to regulate this well essentially closed their ears, and they've been voted down. Example. Denver City Council now is voting to allow 18-year-olds. It was supposed to be 21, and during the campaign it was always about 21, 21, 21. They said, don't ever mention 18-year-olds. Well, now it's passed. It didn't take more than a year for a proposal to be starting to go through now that will allow 18-year-olds. It will be decriminalized for 18-year-olds possession. They will allow character edibles and candies. Even if it's plain packaging, the actual figures will still be there. Governor Hickenlooper, a centrist, center-left Democrat governor of Colorado, who did not like what was going on and would oppose the initiative. Essentially now, he's governor of a state, he has to deal with it. He tried to restrict magazines that outwardly and very loudly promoted marijuana. He tried to restrict them to people 18 and over. He said, at least we're going to put them behind the counter. You have to show your ID. I don't want a 6-year-old to be able to accidentally grab this instead of the cartoon, the comic strip magazine. And essentially, the minute he proposed that, it was struck down by a judge because of a lawsuit by the ACLU, because of the First Amendment. Restricting commercial speech is very difficult to do. So I am one to believe that there is not a way for you all to do this correctly, that once legalization goes forward, it is in the hands of corporate interests and other interests that, again, only make money off of addiction, okay, not off the casual user. And so I would just warn you about certain deals and other things striking, because in good faith they're coming to the table and saying, this is going to happen, we should try and do it. I'm not so sure it's going to happen, not only in Oregon but around the country. And I say that really because we now have experience. Colorado just opened up retail sales a couple of weeks ago. And, the pictures shown on the TV, hey, everything's great, people are waiting in line, they're so happy, there were no murders in line, that's our bar, nobody got killed, so that must be a good policy. What was not as reported as widely, but was reported, were a couple things that I think would shock most Americans, even those who voted for this, because they weren't quite sure this is what they were voting for. A 2-year-old girl has already been sent to the ER with her parents spending at least a night in the hospital for ingesting a pot cookie. Marijuana stores have declared that the high school student is their ideal customer, and they're really looking forward to the 18-year-olds that are now going to be coming to Colorado because of this. The state of Colorado was supposed to tag every single plant, because this was a way to regulate and be responsible. Marijuana plants from seed to sale, quote unquote. That did not happen fully, and sales went on anyway. And the most popular website for those under 35 in the country, it's called the front page of the internet, essentially, reddit.com, reported multiple posts of people talking about the smuggling routes from when you get your legal marijuana in Colorado, how to bring it to neighboring states, what roads to avoid because law enforcement are in the way, etc. And so this has been in the last 2 weeks. Okay, this started 2 weeks ago. We have no sort of, obviously we don't have date numbers yet. But we have some of these. It's not evidence. The plural of anecdote is not evidence. I get that. I'm not saying it is. But I think it's important to report at least some of the stories about how the first... And that doesn't mean that hundreds of people also got marijuana and they were fine. But these are happening. And I actually, when this passed and has gone forward in January... I think in many ways it's woken a lot of people up. You have people from all political spectrum, all across the political spectrum questioning this, whether it's David Brooks from the New York Times on the right, whether it's Ruth Marcus, centrist in Washington Post writing, or whether it's Tina Brown, very liberal, the former editor of Newsweek, now the Daily Beast, questioning how marijuana use, increased marijuana use, will affect the competitiveness of our workforce in the global economy. I think you have a lot of people questioning this, and I would just caution you to think that this is a foregone conclusion, that this is going to happen anyway. Yes, it's true that Oregon has been targeted, along with Alaska, this year by out-of-state groups that are giving hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to pass this and get signatures within a heartbeat. Yes, that is true. Yes, it's true that no matter what happens, this will likely be on the ballot. But it's also true that I think we're looking at Colorado and Washington very closely. And the Oregonians that I met this week that come from treatment centers, that man suicide helplines, that are out there on the front lines on this issue, that are preventionists, that are parents, even if they smoked themselves when they were younger, are now realizing, is this what we really want here in this state and across the country? It is one thing to allow a responsible adult to smoke marijuana in the privacy of their own home with no negative consequences, and as long as they're not getting in a car or doing something else that's going to affect us. It is a very different thing than to allow openly the quote-unquote regulation and licensure, the sales openly of marijuana, which is bound to be commercialized. I'm just, for a minute, Project SAM, what we're all about is trying to find this rational way in discussion, which can often, unfortunately, as we just witnessed, be a shouting match between opposing sides that don't listen to each other. We actually are trying to elevate the debate in this country, at least press pause right now. Let's learn for these other states. It's going to take some time. What is the rush? Now, it is a rush if you have corporate interests in this. Yeah, you want to make money now. I get it. But other than that, what is the rush? We think we need to press pause, at least have a rational and sane debate before really it is too late. Because once we open this to a legal market, good luck trying to reverse it. So, obviously here are some of our allies and founders. I'm very proud to say that the... before I say that, we're testing some of this stuff out in terms of advertisements, but here's some examples of the edibles. And our thing is, can you tell the difference? Probably not. Neither can your kids. This is what we're dealing with. And I think, on the 50th anniversary of the Surgeon General's report, on the day of, we should remember something, which is that in 1964 we had advertisements. You're all too young to remember this, and I wasn't born, but we could look in the books and see that more doctors smoke Camel cigarettes, right, than any other brand, basically. We remember these ads. And then the AMA, despite them saying, actually this is a serious health hazard, we need to be really thinking about what we're doing here. Today, we have these edibles and candies and all sorts of clever marijuana advertising, despite the fact that the AMA is saying that the sale should not be legalized of marijuana, that it's a public health concern. They just released this last month. And really, I think the question is, who will we listen to this time? Are you on the side of the AMA and the American Society of Addiction Medicine and all major scientific and medical organizations that have looked at this, the National Institutes of Health? Or are you on the side of the groups that want to see expanded marijuana use? And unfortunately, some of the groups, not all, the ones that are funding this, some of them are linked to actually they're more than just about marijuana. Let's be very honest about when we progress from medical marijuana to other drugs, what the political agenda is about. So I would leave you with that. Here's a quote from one of my heroes, Nelson Mandela, about the problems of drug addiction. His granddaughter, well known as being in recovery, and shortly before his death, him talking about this issue and the concern. So thank you very much, Chairman. I am very happy to have been here, and I would love to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Questions from the committee? Anybody? Questions? Okay, some of us have seen the presentation prior to today, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Appreciate it.
I appreciate it.
Yes. Okay,
yes.
Mr. Taylor.
Yes.
Ken Burns did a three-part presentation on prohibition, and one of the lessons I learned from that was that it was actually harder to get a drink after prohibition than it was during prohibition. In the sense that you now had a regulated industry with people that would lose their licenses. Why wouldn't there be the same thing as it relates to marijuana?
It's a very good question. I think we need to look at some be careful about apple and orange comparisons with alcohol prohibition to today. First of all, alcohol was generally decriminalized more than just legalized or prohibited during quote-unquote prohibition. But more importantly, alcohol had been legal, since throughout U.S. history. It was illegal for about a 10 to 15, whatever that was, period, and then made legal again. A very, I think, different history than our at least most recent marijuana laws. And I would also say that alcohol, in terms of being widespread available and accepted and normalized among the vast majority of Western population, we can date that to 5,000 BC. Now, that doesn't mean marijuana wasn't used 5,000 or 10,000 years ago. We actually have evidence that it was, but in a widespread manner like alcohol, I think it is very different. So we have a cultural issue with alcohol, and even every public health expert says, look, we're stuck with alcohol. And in fact, not only are we stuck with alcohol, we're stuck with the accompanying industry. If you ever try and do anything against it, good luck. I don't know when the last time it was you raised alcohol taxes, probably a very long time. I think about 40 years from what I remember reading about Oregon and across the country. So the question is, do we want to follow that same path as alcohol? And what I would also say is, again, in terms of what's easier or not easier to get, I'm not sure, but what I do know is that the use levels are a lot higher in this country for alcohol than they are for marijuana. It is much more normalized. It's a badge of adulthood. It's glamorized and promoted at every turn. When you look at Alco-Pops and the other things that the industry does in a very clever fashion, I just don't see why that would ever want to be an example for us to follow for anything else. It doesn't mean that there aren't some bad people with licenses that are making money from marijuana. That is true. And we got to figure out much better ways on the law enforcement side to deal with that. I'm not putting my head in the sand about that. But to make that comparison, when I thought the Ken Burns documentary was excellent, I'll just end with this point. The point that I took away from it was, remember that when he talked about why we actually legalized alcohol, and the primary reason wasn't so much that everybody was so drinking so much and it was a joke, but it was a lot of it did have to do with the money. It had to do with the fact that we were actually promised a repeal of the federal income tax at that time because we were going to have revenue from alcohol. Well, that hasn't really worked out so well for us, I don't think. The revenue from alcohol not only is minuscule, it's a tenth of what the costs are. So, there are some lessons from prohibition, but from alcohol prohibition, but I think the overall comparison we have to be wary of alcohol prohibition versus current marijuana prohibition. It's a great talking point for advocates because if they can compare alcohol prohibition to current policy, it's a winning point because most people hate alcohol prohibition, and so therefore they hope that most people hate marijuana prohibition. But I do think it's apples and oranges in many ways.
Mr. Sabet, I wanted to follow up and get some clarification. You made a statement which I wasn't sure if I understood, and that was regarding how the two laws that are now in Colorado and Washington State were passed. I got the impression that you at least were insinuating that the legislatures in those two states actually did that, when I understand that they were citizen initiatives as compared to one of the proposals we have for our state is to take the sit and wait to determine what is going to happen in those two states over the next 8 to 9 months before we actually would even embark on that, and only after the citizens of this state said that they wanted that as a policy. So it seems like you're playing right into what I personally think is the best way for this state to go forward, is to ask the question of the voters, do you want this type of policy, and watch to see what happens in those two states with the federal government. And if they say yes in the citizen vote in November, then we, the legislature, would take on that task in next year during the regular session. So would you agree with that being the approach to take?
Well, I mean, I think that, look, I think that no matter what we want or not want, this is going to be on the ballot in November. The question is, in which route is it going to take to go on the ballot? And I misspoke if I said, or I was misunderstood, if I said that in Washington, Colorado, this was something that wasn't a ballot. It was clearly a ballot initiative. But the legislature and the local control board in Washington State, different local city councils, along with the state legislature in Colorado, are now essentially filling in all the details right now. So in that way, I was making that comparison that even when there's they're trying to fill in the details with something positive. It wasn't.
Dr. Sabet, so if we actually took on and embarked it on our own to actually put a policy question to the voters and sat back, would you agree with that?
I would not. And the reason I oppose that is because I think that is going to be done under the premise of this is going to happen anyway. Let's at least do it the right way from the legislature and not allow lobbyists to write something and get it passed, which is going to be much worse and put us at much peril. I think that assumes that this is going to pass anyway. And what I'm saying is that I'm not sure that's the case. I think, frankly, that Oregonians are very smart, and when they see what's happening in Colorado and Washington, they may take a second look. It's going to be hard because clearly there's a multi-million-dollar effort to legalize it here in the state, so I don't know how equal the debate will be.
Dr. Sabet, I appreciate you running on with more than what I've asked, but we'd like to make certain we stay within our time frame. So regarding the statement you just made during your testimony, it's okay for an adult to have a reasonable use of marijuana in their own home, but they shouldn't be able to go out and buy it on a commercial. So you're advocating that they should be able to do that, but they have to go to the black market to get their recreational drugs?
Yes, because they're all bad policies, right? Prohibition's a bad policy, legalization's a bad policy. They both have cons. In my opinion, based on, not my opinion, the American Medical Association and everyone else has looked at this from a scientific point of view, the cons of legalization are more than the cons of prohibition. But that is a con of prohibition, that you do have to go to an underground market. Thankfully, though, that market's a lot smaller than the alcohol and tobacco market from a public health point of view today, and those drugs are legal.
Representative Tomei.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So on slide 77, you say that marijuana use among Colorado teens is the 5th highest in the nation. What are the 4 higher uses?
That's a good question. I know that Vermont, well, I do know that I don't know off the top of my head, I can get that answer for you. I do know, though, that a recent study found that the top 17 states in 12 to 17 use were almost, I think all to a T, medical marijuana states, which is very interesting. But I think Vermont takes the cake. Vermont and Rhode Island are usually on top.
If you could get it to us.
Sure, I will.
Thank you, Mr.
Can I just say one point to that, too, though? If Denver were an American state, and I skipped this, but it's in the slides, if Denver, the city of Denver, were an American state, and that's where most of the marijuana dispensaries are in Colorado, it would have the highest state rate of public high school use in the country. Sure.
Any further questions? Representative Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Doctor, so arguably, I am going somewhere with this, but I want to paint some background. Arguably, one of the most effective law enforcement campaigns that I know of, at least in all, frankly, of American history, at least modern American history, was about 30 years ago in Texas. It was an anti-littering campaign. And they came up with this brilliant slogan that many of us know even now: don't mess with Texas. Don't mess with Texas. It's extremely clever. And the way that it got the litter cleaned up and has been effective even to this day, I think, is not that the legislature or anybody else came along and sort of passed a law and upped the citation and the police went out there and it was that society itself absorbed as its value that a clean environment is something that we want.
Sure.
And it became kind of socially unacceptable to litter. And throughout the nation now, we're an extremely clean country if you compare us to places overseas. So is there data that you know of as to is there any way that we can gain an empirical insight as to what not legislators or advocates but society, what are people thinking out there about marijuana?
Well, obviously there are public opinion polls. What I would say, though, is that campaign in Texas, which was so helpful, as you say, changed, and you could almost say the campaign for tobacco is similar in terms of the social, societal.
That's the other one.
Right.
Tobacco is the best example, even better than litter.
Right, and what I would say to that is you don't have counter campaigns to that saying, actually littering isn't that bad. Actually, there's a safe way to litter, and actually we're going to create a framework because we want to control the littering. You don't have campaigns right now out there for tobacco saying, you know what, we're not quite sure about the science. I know the AMA says this. We're not sure. Actually, smoking might be okay. Actually, it might be one of the safest. We don't have those like we do for marijuana. So that would take a massive shift in how we feel about marijuana and where the lobby is right now with marijuana versus where there are non-existent lobbies that I just made up for litter and tobacco. So, so I do think law affects culture in many ways, and it affects normalization. And I do think that when you legalize something, you normalize it and you accept it. Doesn't mean that, again, the opposite policy is perfect. It just means that what legalization is going to be bringing is an acceptance and a normalization, and in this case, making some people very, very rich. Whereas with the littering and tobacco examples, we don't have a pro-littering group out there. I don't see littering groups protesting on this.
Sure. May I follow up? Yes. But you have pro-tobacco groups, and tobacco is the better example. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, smokers, Senator, have to go a long way away now. And I know, even though we love to have you here.
I don't think those I don't know which pro-tobacco groups you're talking about, other than an industry which has been more or less muzzled by the fact that their own deceit was revealed in 1998. So I think for every pro-tobacco group you have, I don't know any pro-tobacco groups, frankly, that are so vociferous like we have some of the marijuana groups. I think it's very different. Okay. And the tobacco, we have less kids using tobacco even though it's legal, and I know people follow up with that. And yeah, it's been legal for 100 years, and we had a lot more tobacco use when it was legal 50 years ago, but that's because as a society we did not take the dangers of smoking seriously, and we had a lobby that made sure we didn't take those dangers seriously. So I just don't want to repeat that for marijuana.
Could you explain where your statement, you said tobacco is legal? It's not legal in this state for minors to have access to.
I was saying for what in comparison to how marijuana would be legal, wouldn't be legal for minors either. It's for people 18 and over. But the argument is somewhat that even tobacco is legal for those 18 or over, yet smoking rates are lower than marijuana rates for kids. So we should similarly regulate marijuana like we do tobacco for those adults to try and get those rates down. That's the normal criticism about the laws. That's what I was saying.
Okay. Mr. Davis. Thank you. Sabet, if I understand you correctly, your premise is that if we legalize marijuana, more people will use it, especially young people.
Yeah.
Is there any historical analysis on that? Because that seems to be the focal point of your whole premise.
So the analysis, right, we never legalized, this is in the modern era, to legalize marijuana. Colorado is the first place to actually implement the retail sales. But what I say is backed up by the research, looking at how people are sensitive to price. And you can look at the RAND testimony on this, and RAND has been very agnostic about whether legalization is good or not. They just put the data out, and what they found is that legalization would drastically reduce the price of marijuana, therefore increasing use, because people are sensitive to price. That's why, again, the tobacco industry fights any increase in price through taxes, because they're going to lose some of their customer base. The other empirical evidence I would bring up is, again, look at the rates of alcohol and tobacco, our legal drugs, versus the rates of use among all Americans of our illegal drugs. 4 times as many tobacco smokers than marijuana, 6 times as many drinkers than marijuana.
Thank you. One last question.
Okay, one.
Yeah. Could you tell us about the funding of your institution? Where's the money coming from?
Yeah, we are all volunteer. Smart Approaches to Marijuana is an all-volunteer organization.
So the Director of Drug Policy Institute at the University of Florida, do you do any research? Are you getting any grant money?
No, not getting any grant money. We're a institute within the College of Medicine. We're focused on prescription drug abuse, smart justice measures, and other similar issues right now.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, thank you very much. We appreciate your testimony.
Thank you so much.
That'll close the informational meeting on the marijuana, and we will open.
We love the earth.
This is the Russ Belville Show. The Russ Belville Show is blogging and podcasting daily at radicalruss.com.
You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry it, you roll it, you smoke it. You take a seed, you plant it, you grow it, you dry